Now here's a really good question that came my way this week. What's God's position when it comes to psychopaths? The questioner says it's been scientifically proven that they are genetically born without empathy or the ability to love. So how can God allow that or create this person if we are perfectly knitted together by him in the womb? Now that's a really good question, and it touches on so many things, from mental illness to the nature of evil, and we can't possibly cover all that lot in a few minutes. So let's start by asking, psychopathy, well, what is it? Well, it's a set of traits that we observe in some people, and while psychologists will want to be a lot more precise about the definition, broadly speaking, there are three observable characteristics that we see to varying degrees. One of them is boldness. Psychopaths have a low fear of things that we really need to be cautious of, including stress, their toleration of unfamiliarity, and even danger. They often have a high self-confidence and assertiveness in social situations. And that's why sometimes psychopaths come over as people who are sort of right in your face. A second trait is called disinhibition. They don't inhibit themselves well. They have poor impulse control compared with other people. This leads to problems with planning and foresight. Their urges are not controlled as they would be in the average population. They demand immediate gratification, and they often have poor behavioural constraints. And a third trait is meanness. We often think about this as having an absence of empathy. Often this comes from having poor close attachments with others, and those poor close attachments are projected into the rest of life. And also a disdain, a couldn't care less attitude to close relationships. People who are psychopaths often don't get love or concern or compassion, and they might use cruelty to gain power, and they may have exploitative tendencies in order to do that. Often they will defy authority. I don't care if my teacher says this or if the law says that. And that leads them to seek excitement in destructive ways. Now, psychologists, who probably will want to be more precise about those definitions, developed a tool called the PCLR score to help assess this. And the interesting thing about psychopathy is that even people who are not Christians, not even theists, will start talking about evil when they encounter them. It's as if the existence of people who behave in these ways gets others to acknowledge implicitly that there's something really wrong with the world when they encounter people like this. Well, what about the spiritual side of psychopathy? Where is God in all of this? In particular, does he decide that it should happen? And if so, how could a God with love in his makeup allow it to be so? Does he just let it happen? In which case, why does he turn a blind eye to it? And in particular, is this nature or nurture? Are you born a psychopath or with some psychopathy? Or does it happen because of factors in your upbringing and life events? Now, the nature question, is it in the genes, is not certain. There is, as of now, virtually no scientific evidence of a criminal gene or a psychopathic gene. The nurture question, does it have roots in my experience, is a little easier to quantify. We know that the behaviour and attitudes of our parents and those who care for us, particularly in our early years, are passed on to us because that's the atmosphere that we grow up in. So yes, there is certainly a nurture component. But that doesn't explain it all. I know a person quite well, as it happens, who suffers a significant mental illness and has been assessed as having paranoid schizophrenia, and yet he came from a loving and compassionate home in which his parents modelled care and empathy. Now, some of his behaviour is psychopathic. What went wrong? I don't know. It's a mystery. But my task as a relative is to love and support him, even though he can be, especially when he doesn't take his medication, he can be extremely awkward. Now, there's an interesting verse in the Old Testament which some people get really worried about, and it has something to say about the nurture aspect of psychopathy. When Moses heard God giving the Ten Commandments, God said this to him, and this was one of the rules that Moses was to relay to the people. He said, "You shall not bow down to idols or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a protective God, visiting the children with the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." Now that word visits is one that we are troubled by. It implies that God allows their influence to be felt by other people. It does not mean that if my grandfather did something awkward or wrong, that I automatically suffer the consequences of that. That's not what's meant here. You see, in their journey through the wilderness, the children of Israel lived in extended families. And as a child, you would be likely to live in the same group of tents as your father, your grandfather, and even your great-grandfather. In other words, a third or fourth generation. Now, if these ancestors were God-fearing, faithful, compassionate men, that's the example you would have been given, and very likely the example you'd follow as you grew up and on into adult life. If, however, they were rogues or psychopaths, their model of relating to the world and the world which is your life would be very different. And their model would be painted on the canvas of your life. That the goldfish bowl in which you learn how to swim would be created by them. Now, there is no guarantee that you would follow them, and the purpose of living in a community of faith is that you wouldn't. But it's more likely that the sins of your fathers would be visited or have a predominant influence in your own mental and spiritual and social formation as you grow up, if you lived in that kind of family as you lived in another one. However, we believe, and actually they did, that the grace of God can break that cycle and see people with a poor, partly psychopathic upbringing changed for the better. I mean, look at the comparison at the end of the verse. The adverse influence of ancestors affects the third and fourth generations possibly, but God's love extends to 1,000 generations. Now that's the comparison that's being made here. Family evil is limited in its effect. God's love is unlimited in its reach. And that seems to me to be a much better and more down-to-earth understanding of these verses that otherwise we find a bit troubling. Now let's come on to Psalm 139, and that's where we see the phrase, God knit me together in my mother's womb. So a few things to note about this, aside from the fact that I kind of find it hard to get my head around the idea of God knitting, but there you go. Firstly, David does not say that the formation of our being in our mother's womb was perfect or flawless in any way. The headline message of this verse from the Psalm is God was involved in bringing me into being. We are not the products of random chance, but of a God who knows what's going on, even in the womb. Second thing to remember about Psalm 139 is it's poetry. And poetry is by its very nature imprecise. It's not a scientific text. Poetry seeks to evoke an emotion or a reaction within my soul without being precise in its use of concepts. In fact, it's the very imprecision of poetry that often makes it very compelling to read. And the third thing is this. This is Hebrew poetry. And Hebrew poetry stacks one idea on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, to help us to wonder at something, to communicate something that is really big out of small, understandable little pieces. So what we see in Psalm 139 is the headline news that God is concerned and is there at our very formation. He oversees the whole formation process, and he loves us from the very beginning, even from before my mother knew I was to be born. Well, I hope that's helpful, and do discuss. Put a comment in the box below, and it'd be lovely to engage in a conversation. Okay, God bless you.